international, wait, I have them written down. Let me just pull these up. Mil gracias a nuestros co-sponsors. The Graduate School Office of Graduate Diversity and Inclusion, with a big thank you particularly to Christopher Perez, the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies in the Department of English, the Office of International Affairs, the Department of Women's Studies, and a big thank you to the Maryland Language Science Center for the use of this beautiful space. And thank you also to Lisette Escariz for her beautiful work on painting the imagery for our conference. And particularly thank you to Eric Tomala and Sabrina Gonzalez for their work above and beyond in making this possible. So I'm excited today to introduce Leti Gomez, Salvador Vidal Ortiz, Maria Emilia Viteri, Ivan Ramos, and Christy Rode. I'll introduce you one by one as you speak, but first I want to say a word about what questions were driving the words, the meditations that you're about to hear. So the graduate committee actually read a fair amount of the work by our panelists and collaboratively came up with a list of questions that we decided to pose to this panel. So those included, what does queer mean to you? What is distinct about queer theory, identity, or practice from a Latin American or hemispheric perspective? What tensions or connections do you see between theory and practice, between art, activism, and academia, or between disciplines and genres? To what extent are identity and sexuality integral to the idea of queerness? And finally, what is your queer agenda, or what would your queer utopia be? So we're going to begin with Leti Gomez. Born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, Leti volunteered with the 1977 Texas Farm Worker March from Austin to Washington, while a student at the University of Texas at Austin. After graduating, she moved to Houston, where she began organizing with the Gay Chicano Caucus. In San Antonio, while working on her master's in urban studies at Trinity University, Leti helped plan a first Latina lesbian retreat and participated in organizing the Gay and Lesbian Tejano Network before moving to DC to begin an internship with the federal government. She arrived just in time for the 1987 National March for Lesbian and Gay Rights. In the 1990s, she was a president of Enlace, a support organization for lesbian and gay Latinas and Latinos in the DC metro area, and one of the founding co-chairs of Llegó, the first national Latino LGBT organization. During the 1990s, she participated in organizing the 1991 National Lesbian Conference, served on DC's Civilian Complaint Review Board, served on the boards of DC Council on Women and AIDS, National Lesbian and Gay Health Foundation, AIDS Action, the DC Latino Civil Rights Task Force, and served as a member and secretary of the DC Democratic State Committee. During the 2000s, she served on advisory boards for the Lesbian Services Program of DC's Whitman Walker Clinic, the Rainbow History Project, and the DC Voices and La Prensa Leadership. She's also the co-editor of Queer Brown Voices, Personal Narratives of Latina, Latino, LGBT Activism. So let's welcome Leti.
Well, thanks very much, Britta, and to the committee for having me on the panel. I just want to say, after sitting here this afternoon and listening to some of the presentations this afternoon, one, I love to lead, dance. Two, it occurs to me that we probably, my generation perhaps, has probably not done enough to share the history of Latina LGBT organizing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And because there is a lot of history there. That was what Salvador, Uriel, and I attempted to do with this book. It's a first attempt to put out some of that history told through memory and through the stories of the 14 activists that are in the book. But to the questions, I'm going to answer a few of them. The one I'm not going to really focus on is Latin America, because I've never been to Latin America. After sitting through this afternoon, I definitely want to know more about what's going on in the queer community in Latin America. But the question of what does queer mean to me, I'm 63 years old, and I grew up I was a child in the 60s and 70s, and queer then was used to taunt us, if you were different, whatever different meant. But usually it was around whether you were suspected to be a lesbian or homosexual. And so now, in present time, I feel like we've reclaimed that word, and I say we've reclaimed it, but also in defiance, because it was a word that was used to hurt us, just like the words maricón, marimacha, les, dyke were used to hurt us. We've reclaimed those words, and we use them and proudly, and we're visible. And I think that one of the things that was always important to me and all my compatriots as we were organizing in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s was the fact that in the United States, we had to be visible as Latinos and Latinas, because where is she? Lemon? As she mentioned, the fact is that still, even today, as she outlined in her narrative about the Pulse massacre, the gay community, the LGBT community in the United States is still seen as white, and it is not. It is far from white. There are many of us, people of the global majority, that form part of that community, and I think we just need to do a better, not better, we need to just be more visible, because, and I'm going to relate back to the presentation on HIV. What really happened in the 80s and 90s is, yes, there was ACT UP. It was led by mostly white gay men, but there was also many Black, Latino, Asian, Native American gay men who were working really hard to make their communities and their needs for HIV prevention and education visible and important to the federal government. And it was a battle. And I think that the fact that one of the things that I will share with you is that Diego was able to get a grant from the federal government to provide that education and prevention service. Salvador here, many years ago, worked for Diego. So I think that it's important for us to recognize that there's this long history, and we need to just be aware of it and not forget it, because if we forget, we're doomed to obviously repeat some mistakes from the past. So I guess all I say about being queer is, and it's really interesting to hear how we've queered a lot of things, not just ourselves, but it is important to be visible always, because before the use of the word queer or lesbian or gay, people in my early generations would not use those, because out of fear to be singled out, to be harmed. And so I think that that's probably still a fear that people have. And one more HIV-related story. This January, there was a conference here in Washington called Creating Change. It's the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force conference. And I heard there that there was a young man in Texas, 18, had health insurance, had HIV, but chose not, because he was afraid to tell his family that he had HIV. He was quiet about it, and he died because he didn't go get treatment. He had access to health insurance, but the stigma and the fear of what his family, how maybe would be turn him out, kept him from taking care of himself. So even today in 2018, we still have those issues that we have to deal with. And so I think being visible, me being out is important because if we go back into the shadows, people will ignore us and forget about us. I think in terms of connections between art and activism, I will say that in the book, several of the activists talk about how art and different art forms were important in terms of community organizing. For example, Olga Orraca Paredes talks about, in Puerto Rico, how she and a group of lesbianas formed this, it was basically a performance group, and they would, through their performance of vignettes, because I remember seeing one of them, they would talk about issues like domestic violence amongst lesbians. They would talk about the homophobia in the community. And so through that medium, they were able to convey not just story, but also educate people, make them aware, and also open up dialogue about how those issues were affecting them. There was also, at Llegó, as a matter of fact, through this federal grant, we created this program called Cultura es Vida. And that program was specifically through our cultura to use expressions of our culture and what people knew to educate them about HIV, to educate them about the importance of being in community and organizing. And so I think that these examples are instrumental in just remembering how important it is to use our culture, use what we have at our disposal to not only reach out to each other, but also to educate each other. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that is even within the gay community, the fact that we express our cultura and our art is not always appreciated in San Antonio at the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. Gloria Ramirez in the book talks about the fact that the Esperanza would host, and they still do, art shows. And some of it is all different forms of art: music, song, sculpture, paintings. And there was, in the 90s, there was a group of white gay men in San Antonio who decided they were going to try to shut them down. And so they went to the City Council of San Antonio, who had been providing art grants to the Esperanza, and lobbied against them, and the city defunded them. Now, the Esperanza went to court and won their case, but it just within the gay community, this hostility towards and I have to say, the Esperanza was also heavily lesbian-led, was majority lesbian-led. So, not just racism, but also, misogyny. And so I think that this is also something that, as women in the community, this is something we do continue to have to fight sometimes. And then I guess as far as my queer utopia, is that we're talking about this totally as history, and that we are just living our lives like everybody else, and that we're not necessarily singled out for any particular reason. I know as queer people we like to be different, so that's not going to change. But I think that my utopia would be that we're totally talking about this as historical. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leti. And we're going to pass on to Salvador Vidal Ortiz. And while I introduce you, feel free to fill in water if any of you. Please pass that down. And Salvador Vidal Ortiz is an associate professor of sociology at American University in Washington, D.C. Aside from having published dozens of articles and book chapters, he co-edited The Sexuality of Migration, Border Crossings and Mexican Immigrant Men, and Queer Brown Voices, Personal Narratives of Latina, Latino, LGBT Activism. He also co-authored with two former students, Race and Sexuality, this year. Aside from his Fulbright-based research on forced migration, internal displacement, and LGBT Colombians, he is engaged in a new project with Juliana Martinez, also from American University, on transgendering human rights, lessons from Latin America. It's a book they edited in Spanish, Trabar el Saber, or Transing Knowledge, based on narratives of trans and transvesti people completing their high school degrees and attending college in Argentina, is coming out with Universidad Nacional de La Plata. He continues work on his manuscript on Santeria, tentatively titled An Instrument of the Orishas, Racialized Sexual Minorities in Santeria. Aside from these books and projects, he has team-edited several special issues of journals, Retheorizing Homophobias, Cómo se piensa lo queer in America Latina, or How is queer thought of in Latin America, for Iconos, Revista de Ciencias Sociales, and Decolonizing the Transgender Imaginary, for Transgender Studies Quarterly. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm very sick, and I generally like that in a person, but not in this case. And I was just hearing how I put aside. How do you manage to put aside from 3 times in your bio? That's really, I must have been sick then too. It's really a pleasure for me to be here, and I want to, being conscious of the time and knowing myself and knowing that I can talk a lot, I want to sort of go through the questions and give you answers that hopefully will motivate us for a conversation. In terms of the first question, what does queer means to me? When we worked on Queer Brand Voices, in the introduction, I had the task of making a distinction between this atheoretical way in which we talk about LGBTQI lives, right, as queer. So queer, in a sense, for a lot of us, is a shorthand for a grouping of identities and experiences. But there's a theoretical way in which we think about queer, which is about destabilizing categories, which is about questioning, confronting, and interrogating power. And what we were doing in Queer Brand Voices was trying to do the latter. We take for granted that people use lesbian, gay, trans, or queer as identities, but we don't stay there, right? And so for me, the oral histories and personal narratives of Queer Brand Voices informed an understanding of queer, which is always shifting. And I really think that when you are conversing with your colleagues, with your peers, with faculty members, it's okay to hear other ideas about how they conceptualize it. No one needs to hold the truth, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you are open to hearing these new interpretations or different interpretations from yours. So for me, the idea of queer is, in a way, so much more than about the LGBTQI subject, right? And it is about transforming how we think about power. So that when we think about the destabilization of sex, gender, and desire, we also think about race and class and other axes of social power. I'm not going to talk about QUI with the Y, because I know Maria Amelia is going to talk about that, but I will say that queer, C-U-I-R, is a term that's actually being used a lot in Puerto Rico, which is where I'm from, but also in other parts of Latin America. So queer with UIC and CUIC is actually circulating a lot in Latin America, and there are different sort of understandings of its use. To the second question about what is distinct about queer theory, identity, or practice from a Latin American or hemispheric perspective, I wanted to be able to say that, as a person born in Puerto Rico and connected to the US through our colonial relationship, I go to Latin America with an understanding of US Latinx race, right? And I have to be really cautious about not reproducing how we understand race and class in the US and even queer theory, and impose that in my readings in Latin America, right? And I say that to a crowd that probably is attuned to that, but I don't think it's bad to get that reminder that all of these concepts, categories, and the ways in which people form their identities are not universal. So we cannot demand that an organization uses or promotes things the very same way that we do in the US without understanding the local context, right? In a way, my work with Maria Amelia in Cómo se piensa lo queer in America Latina was one of those approaches to thinking about how is queer circulating in Latin America? How are people using it? What are the resistances? Are they linguistic? Are they about a framework that they think is bougie, right? All of the above. And how do we then articulate the ways in which folks in Latin America are already using queer frameworks? Maybe not queer theory. As an aside, we just resubmitted, two other colleagues and I, an article on LGBT studies without LGBT studies in Peru and Colombia, where there has been an intense participation of scholars, activists, and artists to make LGBT studies visible, but they had never named the courses LGBT. There's never a program that's called LGBT, right? That could give you a sense of resistance. That could give you a sense of subversive, right? But those are some of the ways in which, in some places, is articulated. And so for me, of course, there's an inherent tension in the US about queer theory, for instance, in terms of transgender and transsexual people. And we see that in the context of Latin America. In my work in Argentina, with travestis or trans women and men, the discussion is often about an imposed queer category, right? But it's also a resistance to the word trans as another imperial category, right? So travesti becomes this class category that is utilized to form one's own class and sort of politically conscious identity, almost in opposition to trans. In terms of the third question, what tensions and connections do you see between theory and practice, between art activism and academia, and disciplines and genres? What I would say in terms of that is, I'm going to give you an example. My sense is that the theory and practice and activism in academia in the places in Latin America where I work, there's an interconnectedness, so that a lot of academic work is done in and through folks who do activism. And that feminist understandings of feminism and gender and ownership of one's body are articulated also through gay and trans bodies in many places in Latin America, not all, by all means. But that's very different from the US, right? Where I can't imagine us asking 10 gay men who are white, do you go to the clinic to make sure that women have access to abortion, right? Like, that doesn't happen as much in the US, right? Like, we separate these mobilization projects, these social movement projects. But in my experience, in Colombia and Argentina for sure, trans women in particular think abortion is as important to them as it is to gender identity law, right? So to sort of understand how the micropolitics and social movements operate in Latin America and in ways that are progressive in a different way is important. There's only 2 more questions. I told you I could talk a lot.
You have plenty of time.
To what extent are identity and sexuality integral to the idea of queerness? This is a great question that I think if we had more time, we'd be here until midnight. But what I would say is queerness began, as Letty was saying, as a category that emerged because it was associated in a pejorative way with LGBT people. But the ways in which queerness is being theorized now is so distinctively not about desire and not about identity. And I want to emphasize that because, of course, in the US we still debate whether the 4 horses of queer theory, Butler, Sedgwick, Foucault, and Warner with Berland, are the founders of queer theory, right? But then you have all this other scholarship. You have ACT UP and Queer Nation, and you have Ansaldúa and Moraga, and you have the Combahee River Collective. You have other forces that were thinking queer, Maybe they weren't using the name, maybe they weren't coining the term, but they were already producing queerness, right? They were thinking critically and intersectionally. And so, while we may be debating whose queer theory are we talking about, the impact of those, of the kind of queer theory that we're articulating, and who we're using to articulate queer theory, I think is really relevant. I'm always thinking of Moragan and Zaldúa as the foundation to how I think about queer theory, not Sedgwick, not Butler, not Foucault. Are they important? Absolutely. But I don't think that that's the only trajectory or genealogical origin that we need to pull from. And so, because of that, if queerness is something that's always already intersectional, then yes, queerness is about desire, and it is about identity, but it is also about race, and about class, and about gender. But we cannot fall into this trap that queerness allows us to forget about the privileges that we have and claim oppression. And more, as queer studies and queer theory in particular have developed, we have been able to forget, ignore, or disavow our privileges if we're cisgender, if we're male, if we're white, if we're upper class. We have put those aside in order to be able to claim conceptions of queer theory that allow us to minoritize ourselves. So in the previous panel, someone was citing Jose Munoz and sort of thinking about desidentifications, right? Like, to me, that's a critical reading to think about how it is that we can understand our social location and own it at the same time as we think queer, and at the same time as we move queer theory forward or queer studies forward. And the last question, what is your queer agenda, or what would your queer utopia would be? Simple. No gender boundaries, no same-sex marriage, no marriage at all, no military, no jails, free healthcare, free education, and affordable housing. Thank you.
I'd live in your utopia, for sure. Thank you so much. All right. We'll pass to Maria Emilia Viteri now, who is a recognized international, engaged, and cultural anthropologist of gender, sexuality, queer, and migration studies. Maria Emilia Viteri's research critically analyzes citizenship, belonging, and identity, illustrating how migration status, gender, sexuality, class, race, ethnicity, and place of origin impact the lives of marginalized communities across the Americas, as illustrated in her book, Desbordes, translating racial, ethnic, sexual, and gender identities across the Americas. She has published extensively in English and Spanish, primarily for an academic audience, and additionally to inform public policy, the international development field, and the media. Dr. Viteri uses a variety of methodologies that bring academia closer to the local communities, such as action research, multimedia, and film. Dr. Viteri's latest research work addresses Chinese immigrant trajectories and public discourses in the Global South, particularly in Ecuadorian media, and its impact on disrupting or reinforcing local gender and sexual norms. In addition, Dr. Viteri will be joining us on campus this next year as a visiting researcher in UMD's anthropology department. So you can keep the conversation going.
I'm going to use my notes from my Mac, because otherwise I'm going to go beyond the 15-minute limit. So, just give me one second. Okay, so thanks again for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here, and even happier that I was able to come from the morning on and kind of get to hear your wonderful research, ideas, and projects. So, what does queer mean to you? Right, Salvador already talked about it as a destabilizing act. I talk about it as queer as desbordes, and also in my book Desbordes, what I try to push forward is that idea of belonging to different places at the same time. So it's kind of going against the idea of ni de aquí ni de allá, but instead de aquí y de allá, y de más allá, right? So kind of adding categories, if you want, instead of antagonizing or deciding either or. And then I want to bring forward as well the queer, and here I'm building on my prior work, particularly Desbordes, Intenciones, which you can find at the feminist studies journals back where the coffee places, and a recent publication that's called Rethinking the Americas, Key Topics in Inter-American Studies, where I was able to kind of do a genealogy of how sexuality was rendered in different parts of history. So I'm going to bring up some of that to kind of emphasize on colonialism and coloniality as part of my second question. So the CUYR comes from our friend and colleague Diego Falconi's notion, in which he's referencing playful Andean guinea pigs known as cuy. Cuy has been a response by a group of Ecuadorian and Colombian activists and artists who protested some potentially neo-colonial practices that surfaced during an international academic queer event that we co-organized held in Quito back in 2014, where Salvador was also present. So the term was used with the suffix "r" as a playful and defiant gesture to re-signify language and point to the need to understand sexual dissidence with and without queer theory. Kind of the same line as what Salvador was saying. So queer politics, which have evolved in different productions of art, activism, and theory, are not to be conceived as part of a united project, but as a series of responses to the arrival of queer politics in the Andean region. So Diego Falconi also proposes the term entundamiento as one of the possible translations to what he renders misunderstanding the verb queering. It comes from the tunda, a mythical character who lives in the Pacific coast of Ecuador and Colombia among Afro-descendant cultures, which has been important in the literature of both countries. La tunda is a kind of a gender-ambiguous character that bewitches and changes the subjectivity of youngsters through playful sexual tricks called entundamientos. Similar to what some of you were presenting this morning, kind of those Salvadorian mythical creatures. So what is distinctive about queer theory, identity, or practice from a Latin American or hemisphere perspective? So I'm going to take a little bit more time in this question because I think it's extremely important. So what is distinct in the ways identity and practice develop is the colonialidad del poder. So queer theory has to address this historicity. Euro-American societies have experienced a long history of discrimination based on social race, gender, sexuality, and class. How men and women are portrayed in different stereotypical ways that reassert gender imbalances that are both Eurocentric, ethnocentric, has a direct impact on the worldviews that academic disciplines convey and the worldviews these perspectives influence. For example, a male-headed nuclear family organization has traditionally been described as a universal norm, reinforcing many Western heteronormative dichotomies such as nature-culture, private-public, which has led to misrepresentation and overgeneralization of male and female roles throughout time. In Ecuador, in particular, Hugo Benavides critiques the heteronormative nature of this historical production and interpretations by questioning at the same time the erasure of a homoerotic figure that's present until our current time, which is called enchaquirados. This is a community that lives in the coast of Ecuador in Guayas province and used to be a homosexual harem of young male religious sexual servants in the pre-Hispanic past. And they survive, their indigenous name is descendants from the Huancavilcas, but until this time, they not only do not suffer from discrimination, but instead they are glorified in a religious way, and they have been able to keep some of that status. And as you know, if similar to, I'm thinking about India, Hijras, Bardash, quotation marks here, or Luche in Oaxaca, Mexico, that conflation of religiosidad, that automatically renders you with a social, political, cultural, economic status. That of course changed completely after colonialism. So one of the central questions on imposed regimes of gender before and after the 1900s hinges on particularly the sexual politics of the colonial settings that render gender inequalities as essential to both colonial races and imperial authority. As the historical documentation available on this topic comes mainly from court cases and medical files, there is an uneven representation of same-sex intimate sexual relations or homoerotic practices. The designation, for example, of sodomy or nefarious practices were centered in men having sexual contact with other men, while there's not much information available on the regulation or punishment or homoerotic or sexual practices between women. So with these, what I wanted to bring some of that history into this conversation and question in order to further problematize and think through processes of racialization and then processes of sexualization as they are not only intersected, but as Jasper Poor will remind us, as ensamblados with class, age, disability, gender, religion, place of origin, migrant status, and so forth. On the third questions, what tensions or connections do you see between theory and practice? And I believe one of the greatest challenges is how to bring together theory, art, and activism across the Americas, given the hierarchies that delimit kind of a priori understandings, and of course kind of automatically places higher value in one as opposite to the other. And we wrote about precisely that with Salvador Vidal Ortiz and Fernando Serrano. And I want to bring a beautiful example of a project by one of our colleagues, Susana Vargas. She's part of what we call Cuir, now Feminista, America's working group. And what she did, and she's from Mexico originally, she's now a professor in Mexico City. So she created this project that's called Mesas de Diálogo, and if you Google it, you will find it. And because she studied back in Canada, what she wanted is to create conversations between kind of North and South ways of producing knowledge about gender and sexuality, thinking queer across these, let's say, two geographies. But not only that, what she also did was to, in these same dialogues, right, choose, let's say, a professor and or an artist or an activist working in artivism in order to push some dialogues around, for example, racialization and sexualization of queer people in both of these geographies. And what she also did is use her classroom, her graduate classroom, and kind of similar to these dialogues, they decided which readings where they were going to read. You have those readings available on their website, and then they did clips, like short clips on these dialogues. Everything is in Spanish, except I believe for Judith Butler's, who was translated by this project. So you will see it's 6 of us, and the first dialogue is going to be between Leticia Sapsay and Judith Butler, and then followed by other scholars that are trying to think through some of what we consider are the main problems, both theoretically as well as in terms of, let's say, action, research, and social change. Now, to what extent are identity and sexuality integral to the idea of queerness? I agree with Salvador that conflating, like doing an equation of identity and sexuality automatically rendering kind of, we can run the risk of deciding what is queer and not, and that's a conversation that we wanted to move beyond 10 years ago, if not farther. So then I'm thinking changing the spelling, through changing the spelling, right, using C-U-I-R, C-U-Y-R, and so forth, we might not necessarily be changing any category or Latinizando lo queer, which is kind of what we desperately try to do sometimes, right? I don't know why. We're so desperately trying to Latinize the queer. But instead, the danger might be to try to render this new spelling with a definition where, again, at the core of queer theory, it's indefinido, acategórico, right? So I think somehow we're moving into that direction, and that's a direction that I believe at least some of us definitely don't want to move. Yes, kind of trastocar queer and play with the language and see what comes out of it, but then trying to find a new definition for CUIR and kind of being comfortable with that, I think that could be dangerous in many ways. Well, and one more thing, I don't know, how am I doing with time? Okay, good. Now, central to these conversation, right, and here I'm bringing intenciones back into our table. And something that I want to highlight here is one question that as Queer America's working group we pose, which is what appears and disappears through that which was experienced, for example, in Orlando and in so many other places throughout the Americas, right? How rethinking these connections might help us to examine the context of loss and risk. And here, I don't know if you might remember these because it happened pretty much at the same time as polls in Orlando, was Guatemala, where indigenous girls were locked in an orphanage called Hogar Seguro, Safe Home, were burned to death while protesting their sexual abuse at the hands of the administrators and teachers, and another marginalized group of people being treated with the same violent logic as are those who are queer. So then another question for you and for us is, how are invisibility and hypervisibility produced? And I am particularly interested, and I think similar to what Stephanie brought us today in terms of creep theory, to what further connections can we do in terms of queerness that goes beyond, as Salvador well said, beyond the LGBTQI, for example, disability, right? In Ecuador, there's an amazing activist group that does the same with rock, kind of rock bands, and rock youngsters that have a particular aesthetic and they have piercings, and because of that they're excluded. Not to say again that we're going to decide that everything that doesn't fit is queer, but then maybe doing those connections might help us to really deconstruct some of the things that need to be deconstructed, which are extreme violence, extreme gender-based violence, which affects in different ways, but affects most people, if not to say all. Now, queer agenda, so here I'm going to be a little bit, I'm going to try to end in a more positive note, because that's usually me. So, 3 things. Then I'm going to end with a more kind of happy ending. So, acknowledging the central role of heteronormativity. So, again, for me, a queer utopia would be how we really pay close attention to epistemological notions. Again, how knowledge is produced and constructed as Anglocentric, Northern-centric, and how it circulates across the hemisphere. And I think that that's a beauty. That's something that each of us needs to do in practice, right? We sometimes do it in theory, we don't do it in practice. So how do we do it in practice? And Marcia Choa has a beautiful proposal for that, kind of creating a bibliography. It's in Spanish, it's in French, it's in Portuguese, and of course, availability of that bibliography for everyone, right? Otherwise, it's impossible to find it. Desinstalar historical narratives that legitimize the state's role, and not only the state's role, organization's role, institutional role in justice, which often act as referential frameworks in legal claims. Then, of course, thinking queer feminista, right? Thinking queer feminista not only for the LGBTQ ally community, but right, as many people as possible, right? So the whole world thinking queer feminista, of course, that would be my queer utopia. And then queer affects. And I think we have a wonderful example of the Queer Americans Working Group. It's a group of colleagues, friends, people from across the Americas mainly. We're located in different parts of the world. We're constantly moving, some of us. But it's affect first that brought us together. And then through queer affect, we started writing together, researching together, presenting together, and going to trips together, doing all sorts of things together, right? Mm-hmm. But it's kind of queer affect that has had these amazing, really positive, I believe, kind of resultado that give us some light, esperanza, and at the same time make us more creative, and at the same time kind of help us to bring our ideas together in different languages to the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll pass now to Ivan Ramos, Assistant Professor of LGBTQ Studies in the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Maryland. He was previously a University of California President's postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. He received his PhD in Performance Studies with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality from UC Berkeley. His first book, Sonic Negations, Unbelonging Subjects, Inauthentic Objects, and Sound Between Mexico and the United States, examines how Mexican and US Latino, Latina artists and publics utilize sound to articulate negation in the wake of NAFTA. Ivan's broader research investigates the links and slippages between transnational Latino American aesthetics in relationship to the everydayness of contemporary and historical violence. In fall 2016, he was a member of the Queer Hemisphere America Queer Residential Research Group at the University of California Humanities Research Institute at UC Irvine. His writing has appeared in several journals, including Women and Performance, a journal of feminist theory, Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and ASAP Journal. He has articles forthcoming in the catalog for the exhibition Access Mundo, Queer Networks in Chicano, LA, sponsored by the Getty Foundation, and the anthology Turning Archival from Duke University Press. Thank you.
Hi everybody. It's about to get really heavy with theory, because that's always how I roll. But first I want to thank Last for the kind invitation today. This has been an impressive gathering, and knowing how much work it is to put something like this together, especially over 2 days in such a variety of events, discussions, is just kind of amazing. And also, I want to thank the graduate student committee, but also the undergraduates, and I want to mark LASK as a space that actually is able to bring in enrich these conversations, and the director of the center, Britta Anderson, for shepherding us here today. So I wrote some remarks, partly because I didn't want to go all over the place, and I'm answering the questions throughout the paper. I'm weaving them together, but I actually am finding that we are very much in conversation with some of our remarks, and just Sedgwick and Foucault will make an appearance at some point. So in my brief remarks today, I want to tackle the question of queer America Queer as providing us with the capacity to interrogate the project of liberalism itself. At the same time, I want to put pressure on this notion of a queer hemisphere as perhaps being more aligned with the project of liberalism than we expect. I've been invested in this question for a few years, not only in my own work, but also as a member of the Queer Hemispheres Working Group, none of the Humanities Research Institute, and founded by Deb Vargas, Marcia Ochoa, and Kirsty Dorr. So to bring together these two notions, America and queer, is an invitation to open avenues of research with particular attention to the sexual logics that structure the very notion of the Americas, as well as the intellectual genealogies that would claim queer as a North American project. It might also help us interrogate some of the anti-Black and settler-colonial logics that underlie the very notion of the Americas. For example, perhaps queer can give us a way to make a renewed reading of foundational texts like Jose Vasconcelos' La Raza Cósmica, which relies on a heterosexual and heteronormative logic that provides a hopeful theory for a cosmic race born out of the reproductive logics of empire and out of the erasure of Blackness and indigeneity very specifically. But that's just a side example for me today. I want to focus on something else. This semester I have been teaching an undergraduate course titled Queer and Feminist Thought in Latino America, and I have been fortunate to have an extraordinary group of students in this class who have been able to expertly tackle any sort of intellectual or conceptual challenge I have thrown their way, and I just haven't read a bunch of shit. During one of our discussions, we turned to the example of the muxes, the by now famed so-called third gender found among Zapotec communities in Oaxaca. Muxe is a category given to birth-assigned boys who at some point, especially in early childhood, exhibit feminine tendencies. The muxe is neither male nor female, but an altogether third gender. And the muxe has become increasingly popular in global media, and we actually watched 3 short documentaries that were produced as an example of the more expansive categories of gender and sexuality that we might find in non-Western contexts. And indeed, we find other cases of third genders across several global sites, as you mentioned, as a recurring model that serves to organize what we call homosexualities when the concept of the homosexual itself does not exist in the same way, if it exists at all. Over the past few years, many have turned to the muxes and other such third genders to challenge the gender binaries and their accompanying sexual logics in the West. And as Yves Kosofsky-Sedgwick taught us, the homo-hetero divide that accompanies Western gender categories is at the heart of a certain kind of modern understanding of sex and the subject itself. However, as my students very astutely pointed out, there is a problem when we think of the muxes and others as an identity. Indeed, if we want to investigate the kinds of critical pressures that the project of America Queer can offer us, we must first understand this. Or to rephrase, muxe is not an identity, but instead a social position. After all, as we saw across examples, muxes are not defined by choice. It is not an identity freely available to gender nonconforming subjects. It's not an agentic choice, but rather muxes have very specific social obligations to their communities and their families. They're expected to be caretakers to fulfill a social role, but such a role comes with very specific obligations. For example, and this came out a lot with my students as a very important point of observation, muxes are prohibited from establishing romantic or affective relationships with ostensibly heterosexual men. As in cases in which they do, and in cases in which they do, they are then seen as dirty, tainted by the threat of sexual relations that defy the social order. Or to put it in other words, although muxes and other third genders are usually offered as examples of the limited identity categories of the West, we must understand that it is not the limited identity categories that these examples challenge, but the notion of identity as a framework of the self. or by reframing Foucault's observation about sexuality as a technique of power that names the homosexual as a particular category of subjecthood, we can grasp that the idea that gender and sexuality belong to the realm of what we would call the individual supports the project of liberalism, secularism, and settler-colonialism. Or to put it yet another way, I want to suggest that a queer hemispheric reading will look at forms of social organization that exceed the project of the individual and would center concepts outside of identity, such as duty. And more importantly, we must understand that such an approach may not support the liberatory logics and rights-based frameworks that secular liberalism is structured around. So in the spirit of interdisciplinarity and cross-geographic reach, I want to turn to the work of one of the most incisive critics of secular and liberal logics, the anthropologist Saba Mahmood. And I offer these remarks, and I'm going to quote her extensively as a tribute to her. She passed away about a month ago, and we're still reeling from her loss. In The Politics of Piety, Mahmoud delivers a trenchant critique of Western liberal modes of subjectivity that have underwritten feminist theory. She argues that this model presupposes, quote, the belief that all human beings have an innate desire for freedom, that we all somehow seek to assert our autonomy when allowed to do so, that human agency primarily consists of acts that challenge social norms and not those that uphold them, end quote. Although we may understand that the different registers that agency might possess, she contends, we still believe that agency stands in opposition to social norms sustained by any number of means. As Mahmoud argues, quote, even in instances where an explicit feminist agency is difficult to locate, there is a tendency among scholars to look for expressions and moments of resistance that may suggest a challenge to male domination, end quote. The problem Mahmoud maintains is that understanding agency under these parameters becomes ultimately tied to the project of Western liberal subjectivity. This creates a teleological narrative, what Mahmoud describes thusly, quote, agency in this form of analysis is understood as the capacity to realize one's own interest against the weight of custom, tradition, transcendental will, or other obstacles, whether individual or collective. Thus, the humanist desire for autonomy and self-expression constitutes a substrate, this lumbering ember that can spark to flame in the form of an act of resistance when conditions permit, end quote. This prescriptive approach to agency obscures the alternative forms of self-realization that don't necessarily rely on freedoms and subjection to imagine a subject. She continues, quote, I believe it is critical that we ask whether it is even possible to identify a universal category of acts, such as those of resistance, outside of the ethical and political conditions within which such acts acquire their particular meaning. Equally important is the question that follows, and this is still Mahmoud. Does the category of resistance impose a teleology of progressive politics on the analytics of power, a teleology that makes it hard for us to see and understand forms of being in action that are not necessarily encapsulated by the narrative of subversion and the rescription of norms, end quote. And so Mahmoud is worried about how this project actually might support an imperial project when it comes to thinking about Islam, especially in her context. Mahmoud illustrates how this analytical approach poses a particular impasse for feminist scholarship and its dual investment as an analytical and political project. Thus, she discovers that, quote, freedom is normative to feminism, as it is to liberalism. And critical scrutiny is applied to those who want to limit women's freedom rather than those who want to extend it, end quote. Mahmoud's critiques are especially important for queer theory to heed. After all, queers have become subjects of resistance par excellence. Mahmoud, in particular, understands that in liberal conceptions of freedom, quote, in order for an individual to be free, her actions must be the consequence of her own will, rather than the custom, tradition, or social coercion, end quote. In other words, what is presupposed here is a sense of will, free from the demands of social and legal norms that function as the other of agency. The problem, according to Mahmoud, is that feminist scholarship, quote, elides dimensions of human action whose ethical and political status does not map into the logic of repression and resistance. And that is the last quote I'll bring up from Mahmoud. For queer theory, this has meant that even when analyzing the lives of non-US-based subjects, we have looked toward kinds of rejected resistance that mirror toward a liberal notion of freedom, right? We want everybody to be free, we want everybody to be liberated. And so what I'm trying to figure out are the ways in which understanding a notion of queerness in Mexico and throughout the hemisphere also means coming to terms with the fact that concepts such as agency, subjectivity, and selfhood that we hope different and specific non-Western cultural contexts might offer might not be commensurate with our own critical desires. Indeed, over the past few years, even the category of mushe itself has become increasingly contested between younger and older generations, as younger queers have turned away from the social duties of the mushe, choosing to understand it instead as a particular kind of trans identity, or in some cases deeming the mushe itself outdated, a temporary placeholder that awaited the arrival of trans and queer identities, and with them the logic of autonomy, subjecthood, and choice. And this is a tension that we see not only with mushes, but in other global third gender formations. And if anybody here has read Arundhati Roy's beautiful last novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, she kind of places that in a South Asian context, that with the Hijra, and as the kind of like character that has become, or like the kind of figure that has become outdated. But for now, I will conclude here without taking a side or deeming one generation more correct than another. Because perhaps what a project, framework, methodology, theory, etc., of a queer hemisphere can offer us is a space to linger within these tensions, to understand that ultimately neither can offer just the right answer. To look at the hemisphere queerly or to view the queer hemispherically, then might beckon us to look for the techniques of power that these categories are produced by and what kinds of modes of being they in turn produce. So I close here with some questions, perhaps for us to ponder. What modes of knowledge become available to us when we study sexuality and gender through modes of power, subjection, positionality, and subjecthood that aim to engage critically with the logics of liberalism, especially when they run the risk of siding with the liberties, rights, and even pleasures that liberalism might afford? But what, in turn, this means that the ultimate goal of an American queer is not to uphold the kinds of violences often produced in the project of the liberal individual, but instead to propose modes of existence that we are perhaps yet to name. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ivan. And finally, we have the honor of having Christy C. Rode with us. Christy is a Cuban-American artist, writer, and musician. Through visual art, storytelling, and punk rock music, C. Rode has thrived to testify the beauty of the imperfect since she began creating art in her hometown of Miami, Florida. She grew up as a self-taught figure drawing artist with a penchant for all things that questioned society, and she began publishing Greenzine in 1997, a fanzine which was originally devoted to the punk rock group Green Day. Merging with the anti-authoritarian intentions of the punk rock community, the zine transformed into a manifesto about being a queer Latina abuse survivor and her journey towards self-acceptance. Her preferred visual art mediums are micron ink pens, chart pack markers, acrylic paint, gel pens, whiteout, and sometimes Photoshop. C. Rode graduated from the Ringling School of Art and Design in 2004 with a BFA in illustration in order to support her ambition to eventually teach. Although at a private art school in a red state, she was fairly infamous as the punk feminist who changed her legal name to a Green Day song and spent most of her time protesting the representation of gender and race in art. Now, C. Rode has almost 20 years of independent publishing under her belt, with years of creating countless illustrations for a slew of magazines, record albums, event posters, and social justice organizations, as well as years of teaching though unconventionally, through workshops and lectures across the nation. In early 2006, C. Rode released her first illustrated novel, Indestructible, a 96-page narrative about high school. In 2008, she released Bad Habits, an illustrated story about healing from an abusive relationship. And lastly, in 2013, her most recent book, Spit and Passion, is a coming-out memoir about Cuban identity, discovering Green Day, and surviving in the closet. C. Rode's current project is The Next World Tarot, a 78-card tarot deck detailing themes of justice, knowledge, accountability, and reclaimed magic. Aside from creating art, Rode is a songwriter and guitarist, having fronted the pop-punk group, the Homewreckers, from 2008 to 2016. She currently fronts Choked Up, a project that does not stray far from the Homewreckers foundations, but proves a departure in style and bilingual lyrics. And tonight at our reception, directly after this panel, we will be hearing music from Choked Up. I'll pass to you, and we need to pull Christy's slides up.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll start answering the first question while we pull up the slides. So queer to me, it does come from this need for punk rock and for alternative community and for survival outside of the margins that I knew of LGBT community, of feminism, of women's community. When I realized I was in a closet, it was about 1992, it was early 90s, and there was queer visibility on American television, on cable, on MTV. There was Sex in the 90s and The Real World, and there was all these things to look to that I would just be like, all right, well, gay people are living, they're on TV, they're doing stuff, they're not all getting killed, so, I'm gonna batten down the hatches and see what happens. But coming out was just not an option, and for me, that also answers question number 2. It's just this need to maintain my culture, to maintain my family, to maintain my upbringing while compromising my identity was very Latino, was very POC. I know a lot of people of color who don't shame me for having come out to my mother when I was 26, 27, because holding on to our culture and our families was maybe more important than our identities and our queer identities and coming out. Like it was more about not losing this one thing that's stable, because, then what else is out in the world? I didn't have friends, I didn't have a community, I had some pen pals, and the internet was starting to happen, so that was a cool gateway for friendships. However, I needed to be out, I needed to exist and honor myself while feeling the sting of homophobia at home, at school, on the dinner table. My family members, it was just so present and so casual too. It was very terms like maricón and tortillera and all these things were just people would laugh watching TV, esa tortillera, parece tortillera con ese pullover flannel, and it was just a joke. And I'm just I'm gonna go in my room now and play Game Boy. But it was eventually the Game Boy wasn't enough. I discovered punk rock. I discovered this other world where I could be myself and I could exist. And so the conversation of queerness wasn't just about, this identity that was completely frowned upon by my family and by my culture and by what I knew, not just Cuban American Miami life, which was Republican as hell and very conservative, and it still is, even though there is a thriving gay community down there. But it was still very Miami, very I was too awkward for it. I was a sad baby butch, and I did not see that at all. Even, the first lesbians I saw in school were in the sports teams, and they played soccer, and they were loved by guys and because they were athletes, and everyone loves athletes. So I needed punk rock, and I needed this world of otherness. And then, as time passed, can I use this?
Yes.
Okay. So I did these zines. This is the green zine. I progressed into just writing about music, writing about support, writing about friendships, about healing from abuse, but then of course the queerness and existing as queer. But something that was happening around the early 2000s was I was finding my community. I was finding my friends who were actually students at the New School, and they were all studying Judith Butler, and they all would lend me their Gloria Anzaldúa books, and they would lend me all, and I would be like, oh my God, gender isn't real, you guys, this is awesome, and gender isn't real, just like time, and but time, all right, well, we got to deal with schedules, we got to deal with birthdays, but gender, what do we got to deal with? We got to deal with loving each other, we got to deal with making sure people love their bodies, love themselves, can exist, respect one another. We don't have to abide by all this gender nonsense. So just like discovering that and having that, being very vocal in a community was also very queer to me, because like a lot of the like lesbian communities I had found when I was very young were just like very like women separatist, very cisgender woman separatist, and those were not my friends. Like my friends were of all different genders, of all, you know, like all different identities that we didn't have a name for in the 90s and in the early 2000s. We were just like freaks and goths and punks, and then eventually when we developed that language, we were able to just be queer and, you know, do all these things and exist. And with that community and that power and that like otherness, like I was able to survive. I was able to just live in the closet. And Indestructible was actually about high school, about queerness, about friendships, but it was very candid, and it was just kind of like one of the first tools that I created that were part of this envisioning of my queer utopia. But, you know, I just like kind of was half a person. My work after Indestructible just kind of delved into talking about abuse, talking about trauma, talking about the disconnection from my body that came from an abusive relationship, but how it was such a metaphor to just being in the closet to my family. And, you know, it's like I have all this knowledge and all this like concept, like yes, there is queer people of color in the world. You don't have to be, the only place that you can be out, not the predominantly white punk rock community that happened to have found you and saved you and held you in Sarasota, Florida. Because I left Miami to go to school, and the punk rock community that I was a part of was in Gainesville, in Florida, and in Sarasota, Florida, in Pensacola, in Chattanooga, and there was like 4 of us that were the queer people of color, and we were just like, when I remember, I'll never forget the day when we were all just like, yo, we're people of color. We gotta like, we gotta talk about, you know, the diaspora too. We can't just leave it to our moms and our abuelas, and we gotta do this. And I'm so excited that like some of the folks I grew up with who really helped me are now just doing important stuff. Just the author Brontes Purnell, who just recently put out a book, was one of those punks in Chattanooga where it was just 3 of us, and Adie Roberson, who does Black Salt Collective, she's an artist, and it was just like, you know, this 2001, and we're just like, our mind is blown that we're just like, oh my God, we're so intersectional, what do we do? And so, like, this book is the product of that, of just feeling so disillusioned by like wanting to be saved so much to the point that I was saved by false idols. And so writing this book, starting a conversation about connecting to my body, starting a conversation about queerness at all, and being in the closet at all, was such a gateway for me to like feel that safety, and to also even start thinking about being a queer Latina, because I didn't have that language. I haven't been to Cuba yet. I haven't been a part of that community, but it's like I've always known. I have family there, and me not going has been a mix of financial stuff, my mom being like, they're gonna kill you, you know, because there's just a lot that we don't know, that we think we know because we study, you know, the Cuban government, and we study all these countries where queerness is repressed, but there's still pride, and there's still like a kind of facade of queer acceptance. But it's still, you know, queers, like every government is complicated. I've never been very excited about any government. And so that there was just this problem that came with like wanting to be like Cubana and queer and like proud, reclaim tortillera, reclaim, you know, like all these mariconería, like all these words that I would hear growing up, and I'm like, I love mariconería. That is when lots of gay people are hanging out and yelling, like, you know, so it's like I wanted all these things in my life. But how do I do that when I know that, you know, the Cuban Revolution ostracized gay people? They would kill gay people. They would, and then eventually just ship them all away in the Mariel boat lift in the early 80s. But then at the same time, they gave exile to Asada Shakur, which I think is just so important. And so it's like, instead of judging a community and a culture by the government, let's think about the people. Let's think about the amazing queer history of Cuba that we don't hear about, we don't know about, because a lot of it is still criminalized. Drag queens are still criminalized. And so we just don't get to learn that much about it unless if we go choked up, let's go on tour to Cuba. We have to say all the songs are love songs. But yeah, between that and then the fact that Miami, super conservative, the queer community was very hard to just exist in and be a part of because I was a smelly weirdo. And then, the more I learned about queer community, the more I learned about these intersections that I just didn't really know how to exist in the LGBT community, because there was this kind of heteronormative kind of foundation to a lot of these gay communities that I was trying to be a part of. And there was this thing with the queer community where there was conversations about poverty, about class, about what kind of feminism are we talking about? Are we talking about the kind of feminism that is supporting sex workers? Are we talking about the kind of feminism that is still kind of telling women what to do and who to be? And is the feminist movement trans inclusive? Is it there's just so many complicated parts to heteronormative LGBT communities that I just became a hermit to punk, very stuck in the punk scene, and it was important, but at the same time I was like, all right, I feel claustrophobic and I need to just embrace my upbringing. And eventually 2012 I started writing Spit and Passion, which is about being in the closet, about surviving the closet. And I don't come out in the book to anybody. It was a hard sell because it was like, how will straight people understand this? You don't come out to your mother, you don't even find a girlfriend, what is this? And it's like, that's not what it's about. It's about my queer experience, which was not just questioning my gender, but questioning my attraction to humans, but also questioning my personality, my existence, just all these things about me that felt wrong at the time, but they didn't feel wrong when I listened to Green Day. I was like, oh my God, Green Day they wrote this song called Coming Clean by Billie Joe Armstrong. It's such an important song. Skeletons come to life in my closet is one of the lyrics, and it's just about questioning gender. And I watch these videos of them and they look so dirty and they're just being weird, and there wasn't this manicured beauty that was in a lot of the important music of the time. TLC was writing very important songs, but I was like, I'm not pretty enough to listen to femmes who make music. And it was just a lot of gender stuff, a lot of things about my identity that made it impossible for me to feel welcomed by anything but dirty punk rockers. And so the fact that there was queer people thriving apparently in San Francisco is what I learned from Green Day. And the first band they toured with was named Pansy Division. They were a queer pop punk band, and I just learned about all these queer bands like Blatz, and I learned about riot girl music and feminism in punk and that intersection being a thing. So learning that all that existed was just super important, and it kind of made me realize the importance of visibility, the importance of all these things, hearing what everybody has talked about tonight, and how, it's so important for us to respect one another's choice to stay in the closet, to have a long journey, to come out in our 40s. That's totally okay, because whether we're holding on to our diaspora, or whether we're holding on to the respect of our mothers, or whether we're just scared of getting killed when we go to our homeland, there's so many reasons to not come out. The world is a mess. So, but at the same time, it'd be awesome if we can all come out. And so when Spit and Passion came out, I was like, I gotta come out to my mom because I'm really proud of this book. The publisher was so supportive of it. And it was the first book that I didn't let the publisher kind of silence me in order to make a dollar. And it actually got like the best reviews. Publishers Weekly was all over it. It was, I was very proud of what were able to do with it. But because it was so real, I was like, damn, I gotta come out to my mom. This can't, she's gonna read this before I come out to her. So I did, and I came out to my family, and it was a long, complicated journey. It was like, can't come out to grandma yet. But of course, Abuela lived, we all lived together. It was just like, how do I do that? But it's fine. Abuela eventually was just like, bless her soul. But yeah, it's like, eventually you just kind of, like, I just needed to stop being so scared, and, because if anybody wasn't gonna accept me, then I was kind of like, all right, well, I've built this other thing for the last 15 years, and I'll go there when you don't want to talk to me. And so Queer Utopia is kind of what I've been trying to create. Maybe, in the past it was very like, the punk rock community is going to be the Queer Utopia. There's going to be, accountability processes for people who mess up. There's going to be, support groups. There is going to be, like, inclusion, and every show is going to be very finely curated where there is the representation of all these different identities. And I try. It's really hard. Sometimes you can't find a bunch of bands that represent every identity, but I try very hard to set up shows that are all fronted by queer people of color, set up events that have, a mix of these identities. But it's super hard, and you can't really maintain that utopian community. I think now I'm on the page with, the utopian community, the system has to do something about that, or just disappear and let us take over, and let us figure out the healthcare, and however, my most recent project is kind of the embodiment of my Queer Utopia vision of the Next World Tarot. This is the cover, this is the Justice card, and the Justice card is typically about kind of like, not blind justice, but unconditional justice, but also a knowledge of power structure and of oppression, and the fact that equality isn't always justice, because sometimes there's equality, but people on the margins need a little bit more. And equality just sometimes doesn't really work, just like freedom of speech doesn't really work, because some people's speech is hate speech. And so justice is about getting rid of all the Constitution crap and making new rules that are based on love and justice and respect and seeing one another, and just kind of creating this other world that was part of the whole like idealizing of queerness and of otherness, and kind of like creating these platforms to like talk about our identities and talk about our survival, but yeah, trying to find a way to get out of those comfortable spaces where we talk and bringing it out into the world. And as an artist and as a musician, I want to do that way, but yeah, there's so much more that we all need to do for the rest of our lives. I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I forgot to slide through.
Oh, cool. These are some of the tarot cards.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize that I had these in here. But yeah, just kind of like re-envisioning the tarot that is usually very Eurocentric, Catholic. And I'm very excited about the Santeria book. I'm like, this is baby over here is the sun. But yeah, it's just bringing in everybody in the deck is a friend, is somebody I knew, somebody that modeled for me. A lot of them like asked to incorporate their spirituality. A lot of them asked to incorporate their identities in some way. But yeah, 78 friends and acquaintances. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, what we're going to do now is take a few minutes for you all to respond to each other, to maybe speak to some of the ways that you see your contributions today speaking to each other, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for questions from the audience. We can just pass this back and forth.
I just talked, so I feel a little.
Well, I think, I'm certainly, as an activist, not an academic, I think there's a lot, there's such a richness here in terms of, thinking about not just the theory, but also how we're using the word queer in so many different ways. And I guess I'm really intrigued by what might be happening in Latino America right now. And the notion that, yes, the United States is so dominant in this hemisphere, and how we, I think Salvador said it, how we somehow impose, we impose, our culture in the hemisphere. And I think it's just so, it seems to me, and I want to hear from the audience, those of you that have lived and Amanda has, in Latin America, I want to know, like, is that really how it's perceived in Latin America? That the United States is imposing itself in even our queer culture, imposing itself.
Okay. Yes. So my answer to that will be definitely, and I can tell you the particular, I don't know how familiar you are with Ecuador and Ecuador's politics, aside from Stephanie, maybe who's originally from Ecuador. So when I went back after doing my PhD here at the U, being a visiting professor at Catholic U, I decided to go back to Ecuador in a moment where we had a socialist president that seemed promising, beyond ideology. Seemed that this former President Correa was kind of opening new spaces to think through gender and sexuality, among other things, which no other president has touched before. So new constitution. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but our 2008 constitution is one of the few constitutions in the world, with South Africa, that prohibits discrimination based on the basis of sex and gender identity, right? So pretty progressive, seemed promising, but of course, as you said, we know how politics and governments go. So went to teach at a graduate university on social sciences, and brought right with me kind of queer theory. Wanted to explore what does queer mean in the Andes context and so forth. And I was accused of being imperialista and kind of, a gringa, and I forgot my orígenes, and I was not Ecuadorian anymore, so I was not read or recognized as an Ecuadoriana, but instead, because of the political context, of course, that didn't help, kind of bringing imperialismo through queer theory. And that still holds. I mean, that has not ended, and I'm talking about 7 years ago, probably. And if you Google, you will see their writings in the Andes, and I'm gonna talk specifically about the Andes, which is what I'm most familiar with, that question queer, and that they equate queer with nuevamente imperialista, colonialista, neocolonialista, and everything colonialista that you can think of, right? Now, of course, my argument, the way I saw it was, my question to, let's say, these interpellation was, why don't you question other theories? Like, didn't Foucault travel from France? Isn't France a colonialista kind of country too? Or, what about Marx in Germany? You name it, right? And then, of course, what response did they have? They had no response. So then I built an argument in which, again, right, because it's queer theory, because it's about gender and sexuality, then it's homophobia, academia homophobica, right? That's what it was. With the facade of bringing imperialism, not to say that it might not, right? So there you see the conundrum. Could be, we should not impose our readings of queerness in any country in the world, right? Not Latin America or any other country, but again, when you look at the global, at the local in the global, then you also have these other aristas, right? So that no linear reading on queer and no queer and queer theory for me, I was at the Women and Gender Studies department at that time, was a way to try to expand a very heteronormative way of approaching gender through queer theory. And that didn't go well. I mean, we did a lot. Publish, cómo se piensa lo íconos, cómo se piensa lo queer en América Latina. We did like queering, paradigms conference. I mean, you know, I like took over Flaxo and Keto and Ecuador, I have to say. Like, now or never, you know, we'll do this. It didn't go well in the sense that there's still the perception that queer theory is imperialista. But again, my reading as an Ecuatoriana, having lived there for 7 years, is that there's this layer of homophobia academic in addition to.
I absolutely agree with what Maria Amelia was saying. I'll give you a very different example. I have a colleague who was in Chile for one of the last hemispheric encuentros from NYU's Performance and Politics Center, and he's an indigenous identified Latino man who called out blackface among Chilean activists. And of course, the fact that he called out blackface was used against him for being imperial, for wanting to impose like racial readings, right? There's no easy answer. And he's also very particular, right? So I give you that example to say that we have to separate who is the person that's sharing the information, right? And how is that being conveyed, but also what are the frameworks, right? Because I, like Maria Amelia, in my work in Colombia, and it's mostly gay and lesbian folks, resist queer theory, I always say, you know, intersectionality is also from the US. And we embrace it, right? And of course there are criticisms about the sort of white gayness of queerness, which is why Teresa de Lauretis coined and disavowed the term, right? Because Teresa de Lauretis had a very different project and a post-structural project, which is what queer theory ended up doing. And so to me, there's that sort of friction as to what people imagine it to be and what it is, but also who conveys the information and how it is articulated. There are people in Latin America who've read Butler in English before it was translated in Spanish, right? We can't assume that people don't have the knowledge. We are one of the few countries that are monolingual. Most people in the world are not, right? And so people who were curious about queer theory were reading theory, whatever was accessible to them. And so there are perhaps elements of class and access, but people were engaged with queer theoretical formulation, so they had access to it and they could, it could impact their lives, right? It could be something that they used in academia, and many folks did, right? So, so I wanted to say that, but also as a plug to the last thing that Maria Amelia had said, which is queer affects. For those of you, so this is a separate point. For those of you who heard Maria Amelia's last comment about queer affects, there is a book called Telling to Live, Latina Feminist Testimonios. It came out in 2000, 2001 from Duke, and it's academic Latina women who wanted to write a book together, who wanted to theorize together, but then they realized they didn't know each other. So they went to some encuentros and some retreats and got to know each other, and a lot of what they wrote was from first person experience, right? Very similar to the Queer Americas Working Group that Maria Amelia and I are part of, right? So that engagement. The one question or sort of, it's not a response, but I wanted to add to what Christy was saying about her experience, because I'm reminded of a dear friend, Carlos de Sena, who wrote Tacit Subjects about Dominican men who are gay, and he gives this example in the book at the very beginning, like, listen, I'm in bed with my boyfriend, my mom opens the door, brings the breakfast, we're like half naked in bed. Do I need to come out to her, really? Like, do you really think that I need to put her these words? And so it is a questioning of like how, as Manolo Guzman has argued, like, you know, gayness is like this love that cannot stand not being named, right? Like, and so like there are, I don't think it's cultural, I don't think it's specific to, right? Like gay and lesbian communities were founded because there were white people from Oklahoma and Idaho who went to San Francisco and went to Chicago and went to New York, right? So they were also migrating and they were also afraid of coming out. Like, let's not assume that communities of color cannot come out, and in fact many do, and they do in the US and they do in Latin America, right? But there's also that experience that that Christy was talking about, which is there are other spaces that are not being in the closet, and that it is okay sometimes if you are in the closet, except for the damage that it may do to you, but it is okay, right?
No. I could talk a little bit. Yeah, I was gonna like also just ramble, but I agree with everything that was being said, and I do think that it's also really because growing up listening to the Cuban Revolution side about how, you know, homosexuality was brought by the colonizers, and it's like you could look at it that way if you want. You can make anything brought by the colonizers. The colonizers messed up so much and it affected so much that you can trace anything back to them if you want to. But what about, you know, like the ancestors and like the gay ancestors and like the Orishas we were talking, and then, like there's just so much queerness in the ancestral magic of the Caribbean. I'm speaking specifically about Cuba, and yeah, it's like when I found my community where I was like, I could be myself, I could be Guana, I could be queer, we were all just like, oh my God, you know, like gender queerness is a part of that magic and that spirituality. Like there's genderqueer spirits who have been worshipped for billions of years, and like as part of African diaspora magic. And then, you know, I'm always like, I'm sure there's some Catholic gay stuff that we just never heard about. I'm like, Santa Barbara was a dyke. But, you know, it's just like, it's always, and it was something very hush-hush, like when I was little, and it was very like, oh, Chango, you know, if you're a woman and Chango is like your protector and Chango is calling to you, she's a dyke. And I'm just like, maybe that's true. I think that it's not celebrated. I think that it's frowned upon. Like, don't let your daughter work with Chango because then she'll become gay. I think that it's like, what about just seeing it as like, oh, like these spirits have that, like, with the stories that go with this magic, there is so much queerness and there's so much normalization of queerness. It was never like, oh my God, so ashamed, you know, this person is like presents as lots of genders. It's like, oh, this person is magical, powerful, and can blow up the world, and they are every gender. So, you know, like, I don't get it. I don't get the whole like spiritual anti-gay thing. If you actually are going to embrace your entire ancestry and not just the white Roman Catholic figures that a lot of Latino communities embrace while erasing the indigenous and the African ancestry. But yeah, I can go on about this forever too. I think we should open up to questions.
Yeah, let's do that. Project.
It's not really a question, it's actually a comment, and it has to do with what you were saying. Growing up in Cuba and being exposed to the gay community and being aware and involved in the community, I will say that it's a very censored place. Actually, parties and reunions will usually take place places that nobody knows where they are. You actually will go on a bus or in a car and go without knowing. Nobody will know the address because these were places that were hidden. And you will actually, very often, the information will go out and these places will be busted and police will be there, and a lot of this, the gay community in Cuba has suffered a lot. But I wanted to say something because I think that thinking about this relationship with the US in terms of theory can also be applied to thinking in terms of practice. and like on the ground what's happening, because the relationship between Cuba and the US is so charged. In Cuba, thinking anything US related is censored or has been censored. So the gay community actually has, for a long time, embraced, of course, because it embraced music, for example, or queer behavior, or queer divas from the US in ways that also disrupt that idea of that sort of thinking about US and Cuba in a colonialist relationship only. That there are ways in which there are solidarities and in which there are sort of encounters. And so that in a way, the queer community from Cuba is actually thinking in terms of, I don't want to say appropriated, but finding the same languages with music and the culture around queer culture in the US. And that itself, it's in Cuba censored, and it's been problematic for a long time. So just wanted to.
Can I just say, I was in Cuba last year, in last May, for their gay pride, and it was, I mean, it was incredible. You know, it looked like a pride parade you would see here. They had floats. You know, they had all the different organizations, nonprofit organizations that support the LGBT community there. And Mariela Castro is, she's like an icon in that community because of her support for the LGBT community. But it was, I mean, it was interesting to see, and I mean, it was like a whole weekend of festivities, and so I was quite surprised, actually, to see how open it was. And this was, of course, it was in Havana, so, you know, who knows what it's like in the countryside, but...
They're also kind of required to do that now, too. Are
they required to do it?
Well, you know, it's kind of like they don't want to deal with some human rights shit. Like, Mariela has done a lot of awesome stuff, like the queer theory classes in the college, like queer studies in the college, and the pride, but it's surface. It's kind of, think of, like, police violence in the United States.
As usual, too little, too late. It's so little, too late. Okay, we're talking about, you know, what, 40 years later? We're always behind. I'm Cuban, by the way, that's why.
Yeah.
There's also regulation going on with Maria Castro is doing, and I know that the gay community is complaining about how now their bodies are being regulated in ways that were not before, because they were not, like they were gay, they were openly gay, they were visibly gay, but they didn't have to deal with the regulations that are in place now that are affecting them. Even in terms of community, they were saying like, we had our communities, and we got things done through our communities, and now the communities, because there is a regulation and there's apparently open spaces, there is a different kind of relationship with access and with visibility. So.
I just want to add that I worked with Alberto Roque Guerra, who was a doctor working with Mariela Castro on surgical reconstructions, and after he no longer worked with her, and I think it was amicable, but it was a goodbye, he was able to talk about how a lot of the transitioning processes in Cuba are about regulating the binary, right? They're like the transsexuality of the 1950s in the US and in Europe. It's about, I'm gonna fix you to be a woman, right? I'm gonna fix you to be a man. You cannot be in the middle, right? So it's a little, it has multi-layers, and it doesn't mean, of course, some of the motivation may be to place themselves on a global map positively in terms of human rights. But on the other hand, there are some normativities that are still being reproduced in the process.
Too, and also the Cuban Revolution was very comfortable with certain very prominent gay people, like Alfredo Guevara, like Nicolás Guillén. I mean, there were people who were basically collaborating with power, and that was never uncomfortable, right? Like Sara González, I mean, you have like a list.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a way about just power and government, and they're gonna be doing all kinds of, like, practicing all kinds of institutionalized racism, institutionalized homophobia, but they're still gonna have people of color and queer people in office, in the Congress, and that, like, can get away with stuff And who knows why? I mean, maybe money, family connection, like there's just so many reasons why governments are corrupt and why, like I personally, like I'm going, when I bring up Mariela Castro at my family parties, I'm just like, no, but Mariela's gonna be the next one. She's gonna take over. And my mom will be like, don't say that in front of like the older people because they're, they don't wanna hear that. But yeah, it's nice to believe that things are changing, but yeah, at the same time, like I don't expect much.
Well, it would be nice not to have a tropical monarchy
Yeah.
with the same last name being perpetuated.
Yeah. I know, I'm like, it's like, of course, wait. We can also talk about Cuba forever. Like after this. There's so much, there's a lot going on in other
Well, well, you're still talking about Cuba, right? Or not?
aquí que la cubanacería ya estamos aburriendo.
Bueno, yo vengo a Guayabera por un, ¿sabes?
Ay, mira, Guayabera, mira qué linda! Without sleeves too. That's nice. It's the classical Cuban top.
Bueno, mi pregunta es, estábamos hablando sobre la ideología imperialista estadounidense y en la comunidad de Miami, no sé, en Cuba cuando estaba creciendo allá, era como un secreto a voces. No necesariamente se definía una persona como gay o queer, es que gay no existía, ya se decía invertida, o eres un bugarrón o algo así. Pero viviendo en los Estados Unidos y viviendo en Miami por muchos años y ahora estoy acá, ese concepto del closet tiende a seguir estando presente en nuestras vidas y creo que los comentarios del doctor Iván Ramos, I think earlier in the semester we were talking about just the hegemony of the closet and that not necessarily transferring and leading into Latin America as much. And I remember that you quoted Juan Gabriel, I believe, when he was like, le preguntaron, are you gay or something? He's like, lo que se ve no se pregunta. So I'm thinking about if you can maybe you or everybody talk a little bit about critiques of the closet and particularly how they function in Latin America, and ¿es eso una ideología estadounidense imperialista y cómo podríamos de alguna manera escapar de esto que es tan
It just seems to be I mean, as we talk about it more and more, it just seems to be that, yes, if I'm from the United States and that's my lens, that's how and that's my language, that's how that's the language I use to view and comment on things. So, I would like to, it would be good to hear from Sudamericanos about, what is it? Yes, this issue about, the closet, that's it's an Anglo invention.
But not really.
Don't you think?
People have been in closets for a long time.
Well, but
like
the concept of closet.
Like how Santeria became synchronized with Catholicism because they couldn't practice their real magic.
So
they
that's a closet.
disguised it. It's a closet. It's
Okay.
Yeah, because I think it's just about survival, and it's like, but it could. I feel like I totally agree that like the closet and like this existence where you have a secret gay identity and it's very specific to the gay experience, like could be an American thing. It could be and if the concept is brought to other places, it could be imperialist because of it's being seen as an American concept. But it's also like, I don't know, I find it really important to like not think about that and just strip it down to survival. Like, if you gotta lie to your mom about your boyfriend because your mom doesn't support you, dating people of a different race, like you're in a couple closet. And it's not, I don't like using that word because it is ours as queer, closet is something we have, at least we leave us our closet, But like, it's the same, it's a metaphor, it's like the same idea of just like surviving secretly in some way.
Well, okay, so the way that I would put this, or the way that I've been thinking about it is like, okay, yes, like I've been teaching into LGBT studies this year, so I've been having to refine how to put this to my students. And it's like, yes, okay, there is such a thing as same-sex relations, cross-historically, cross-geographically, everywhere. The ways in which they're sanctioned or not are very different. However, if you think that the project or the right, if you do have a same-sex attraction, is to ultimately be able to walk down the street with your boyfriend holding hands and not being harassed, that's the liberal project, right? And that's what we have to reckon with. And it is potentially serving a larger imperial interest, and it could be okay, right? And I think that's like what the tension that I want to hold. It's like, that it's like, you know, like, if the right to love somebody is a framework that has been installed, right? And it's a fairly recent framework. Like, I always like try to shake that out of my students to be like, no, people haven't loved each other like this forever, right? It's a, you know, like 17th, 18th century invention. Then we have to think through, okay, how do we do that without actually, like, I think that the word that I haven't heard as much that maybe like we can think about is like, how can we think about queerness and the hemisphere, or like, you know, queerness perhaps as going to the hemisphere as an ethics, right? Like, is there an ethical project that perhaps it can give us that isn't not just about like, okay, rights or no rights, imperialism or no imperialism, right? But it's about an ethical practice.
Well, the other things that we haven't talked about at all, I mean, is class and religion, and how, you know, depending on which class you are, you have more access, you have more economic privilege to maybe, because we know that in Victorian America, sorry, you know, in that period, yes, the privileged class, you know, there's how many novels have been written about same-sex relationships in that class, but you know, I think that is something that we also need to look at, you know, what class that, you know, what does class contribute to being able to be, you know, out, and, you know, and also, and religion, you know, Latin America is predominantly Catholic. Here we have a diversity of religious practice, and so is that diversity of religious practice also free us to maybe to be, you know, I guess to be more free and that of religion.
I wanted to make sure we didn't, I don't want to leave feeling uncomfortable about this, so I want to say it. I don't think it's appropriate to imagine Latin American culture and the closet as synonyms, because that creates an opposite, which is no closet in the US, and that's bullshit, and let's call the bullshit, right? Now, white men are on the closet, they just call it on the DL, appropriating from black culture, right? But, so that happens in the US too. And let's also separate, and I think Ivan might have been alluding to this, sort of global circuits of gayness, because there are leather bars all over Latin America, and those bars are not for the pride necessarily of the Latin Americans who live there, but for the tourists, right? The tourists who come from the US and Europe, right? And so like, let's think about that a little bit in terms of the global circuits of desire, first and third world, and the dynamics that are formed there, right? Like sometimes there's a whole move to make gayness appear in certain spaces, literally for the consumption of the other.
Absolutely.
And I'm thinking about examples from what you all have mentioned in terms of the closet. So, University of San Francisco is a liberal arts college. Imagine a liberal arts college here in the States, make it elite, make it private, add a lake, add some decks, add a pagoda, and that's my university in the suburbs of Cuir, right?
Correa used to teach there.
He was trying to, go against the university because, of course, the founder is a liberal guy who did his PhD here at MIT. He loved MIT, and he went back and said, why don't we have a university like that in Ecuador? And he had all the money. So, the credit is, instead of investing in XYZ, you mentioned, then he decided to invest in a university. And now, this is one of the best ranking universities in Latin America and so forth. Just to give you the context back. In that context, gay students, gay male students, very privileged, as you were saying, what happens to those extremely privileged Ecuadorian students, right, in Quito. From one day to the next, they do not come out because they know if they come out, they're going to lose their stipend, their car, their credit card, and especially they will not be able to attend USFQ because who's going to pay for that? And in that class, it's not like here, you have access to financial aid, right? You might even work at Starbucks and other, coffee places at the university, and you will be able to survive. You can rent a room with other people. I mean, there are ways, and you can also move. Like most of my queer friends in DC, they come from, Indiana and so forth, and some of them have not seen their families for 10 or 15 years. They reinvent themselves. What I have seen with these examples is that these students, their family accidentally realizes that they are gay. And then next day, they have no place to live, no place to go, no university, no job, no anything. And then usually what we do as queer professors, we try to organize and then help them go through that phase, find them a job, host them at one of our houses, kind of give them some network. Because although they are extremely privileged, because of that, in that particular context with these structural problems, they will not be able to continue studying. So, something to think about. And then the other layer of that, and the way that I have been reflecting, is the tejido de la familia, Latin American tejido. It's like you depend, class-based, and in Ecuador and in the Andes, I think it might be more pronounced from what I have seen than Central America. Your last name, right? So your last name will kind of grant you, enable you, or disable you certain access to certain networks, right? So if you have the quotation marks the right last name, then you're gonna live on the quotation marks right neighborhood, go to the right school, and then kind of automatically you will have social mobility. Like your social mobility is guaranteed throughout, of course. The social mobility will also have to be heteronormative, of course, right? It's structured within heteronormativity. But within that class structure, then ways in which students, in this particular case or communities, survive is by deciding if I depend on my family for survival, for studying, for work, and so forth. Usually what I have seen is that they would not decide to come out verbally or in a written form, so that because their family is important, they want to keep their family. They are very aware that their family is highly homophobic. They try to teach the family, they try to teach the family through films, through support groups. There are at least 2 now in Quito, there were none before. So finding different strategies. The last one that I have seen they resort to is saying, I'm gonna write a letter to my parents, and then I'm gonna invite them for dinner, and then I'm gonna come out. Because when they come out, their entire world collapses. And in Ecuador, they would not have the possibility of, I'm gonna reinvent myself and go to the coast, and be someone else. I mean, Ecuador is a country the size of Colorado. It's really small, networks are really tight. So then, as Salvador said, we do need to look context by context to see how does the closet work.
Because the family has to come out too, that's a big problem.
Exactly, stigma, and then you lose social status, and then it's a disaster, right? Based on this structure.
I have a brief comment in response to that. Something that came up yesterday in the mask making workshop was Horacio Quiroga's writing, which we actually read in a workshop with you, Ivan, that offers the mask possibly as an alternative symbol to the closet, where the closet is so often a linear narrative, so common in the U.S., right, of coming from in to out and then having arrived. And Quiroga writes about the mask as more of a strategic concealing and revealing in a way that allows people to preserve familial ties or ties to communities and protect themselves when that's necessary, right? Anyway, we are short on time, and there's another event starting shortly. So I'd like to invite one final comment or question. Jonathan, you've gotten a lot of speaking time today. Yep. So I'm going to open it up to anyone who hasn't had a chance to share with us. Please.
This is amazing. Thank you for doing this panel. I'm interested, I guess, in kind of breaking down the notion that that everything maybe either originates from something indigenous or something that's kind of colonial or imperial as a project. Because I think that there's a lot more complications in between all of that, things that people make their own, right? It could be santerias, a mix of lots of things, and the ways that that then changes over time. And I guess I'm wondering about sort of transnational cultural flows, within Latin America, of queer or LGBT culture, and just things that you have noticed that you think maybe are notable or interesting in that respect. And what are some ways in which you see kind of like queerness sort of being owned or created and then sort of shared even within the Latin American context?
I mean, I'll just say that the first time that I saw that actually the X being used was from movements out of Chile that were actually conversion movements in Spain, and I would say like the biggest thing is that like the thing that like we kind of like talk about or we didn't talk about certain groups is that they are more. I think the conversations that are happening in certain groups that maybe aren't affiliated to human rights frameworks is that one, they're a lot more visibly anti-capitalist. And for them, that the priority is kind of like to think about or against globalization and capital as the things that are structuring their daily lives. And they have like more relationships to like, I think that the other thing that we're leaving out that I think that maybe like you kind of pointed to is that they do have very different relations to what a Latin American left is and how that Latin American left is supposed to like fight against those things. So I was thinking actually about the activism question. I was thinking that a lot of gay activists aren't necessarily using their activism for gay rights. So I'm thinking of somebody like, I can't remember his like given name, but Che de los Gays in Chile, who like queers or like drags the figure of the Che, not for gay rights, but to ask the state about the disappeared and like those that have been abandoned by the dictatorship, right? And there's somebody like Jose Rodriguez in Mexico who's like contesting the disappearance of students, or like of bodies in a way that is, that like knows the intersections of those concerns. But there is like, those conversations I think are happening in really interesting ways, and I think the Hemispheric Institute has been really good at bringing those artists together. And that's why like the last time they were gonna do it in Mexico City was during the elections, and the Mexican government shut them down because they were like afraid that they're gonna have a bunch of performance artists who were queer, like protesting against the government and not necessarily being like gay rights, right? That in that case, like the kind of pink washing model that like, we want gay rights isn't gonna be there, but that the kind of like, we wanna overthrow the government. And I don't know if American gay rights movements care about overthrowing the government, right? They just want to get a gay president. Yeah, no, that's, like actually,
I was like,
the
that's
punk
how I
movements,
felt
yeah.
the part,
Yeah.
or the gay people coming out with.
Yeah.
But it is true. I also feel that with the use of the Latinx like term, and when I was starting to have more Latinos in my, or Latinx people in my queer community, starting to use the X for the gendered, for me it was just about this language is gendered. Why, if we're referring to a group of different gender Latinos, why is it Latinos? Why isn't it gente? And like, so it was just like taking away that gendered, and there was a lot of scenes I would read where they would like literally take away every gender of every word. Like silla was CX. And like libro, libras. And it was awesome, but you're reading this zine and it's like, pero qué cosa es esto? Yo no le puedo enseñar esto a mi abuelita ni nadie. So like, yeah, and I feel like it's really interesting being in Latino communities that are activists, anti-capitalist, that I find through punk rock and through activism in general. there is like this barrier between the queer, like who cares about the queer struggle and who is more focused on immigration. And then it's like, oh, the queers care about queers and immigrant queers, and like what about detained immigrant who are queer, who are having a deeper struggle than straight ones. Like there's coalitions for that. There's Queer Detainee Empowerment Project. Like queers have a different experience as far as being marginalized by the state. So if you're a Latino community and you're talking about immigration and you're talking about police violence, there's so many things that also need to be talked about. And I feel like whenever we want to be, let's talk about anti-blackness in the Latino community, let's talk about gender, it's just like, oh wait, no, this is annoying, we don't want to deal with that. So I feel like I'm definitely at a place where I'm always just looking for the spaces, Latino spaces that, you know, and if Latinx doesn't even roll off my tongue as easily as it should because of language and because of my upbringing, but you know, I think that we could try every day to just kind of make that knowledge more accessible and more like the norm, as far as, you know, if we're going to talk about anti-capitalism and our struggle as first generation or immigrants, or it's gender and queerness is a huge part of your privilege, your experience, what access you have, you know, we've talked about all this. So and I love that I'm saying this in front of Julio Salgado's work. He's one of my all-time favorites. I exist.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. So we are actually going to need to close there. I invite you all to keep the conversation going over dinner. And so there's another event starting here shortly. So for our guests, I invite you downstairs to the first floor to enjoy conversation with our panelists. And Chef Lucrecia Espinal is the small business owner of Mexican Dishes. So her contact information is